Okay, Dr. Gary Habermas, it's nice to have you with us. I appreciate your time, man. How you doing?
Thanks, guys. It's good to see you again and be with you and looking on a room that I was in. What was it? A year ago?
Yeah, you were here January. I guess it was.
Year ago, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's good to be with you. Long
Yeah,
distance.
yeah. Awesome. Well, all right. So, just for people who may not be familiar with your work, tell us who you are and what you do, and tell us about your research on near-death experiences.
Well, my name's Gary Habermas. I'm a research professor at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. I've taught here for 38 years, give or take a few months, and I teach full-time in the PhD program, teach apologetics. My, let's say maybe the easiest way to say it is my first love is the resurrection of Jesus. My second topic out of about 5 major topics I speak on, probably the second one for sure, is near-death experiences. So I've been following the near-death research since 1972. Probably half your people listening to this were not even born. That makes me really old, but that's a long time. That's a lot of time. I'm a reviewer for the only peer-reviewed near-death journal in the world, or so they tell me. And so I've been working on this topic for a long time.
Awesome. Yeah, so Alan and I were talking just earlier about near-death experiences and the value or potential value in near-death experiences. Can you speak to that? What sort of value is there? Is there any value in it? Because we were talking, it seems like when the average person hears, "Hey, I had a near-death experience," the next response is, "Yeah, well, you must be crazy," you know. So
yeah, well, people have got to get over that. The latest, or at least one of them, it's a few years old now, but the latest medical treatment of this, published by a State University Press, starts out by saying that they estimate that in North America and Europe alone, up to 30 million people have experienced near-death experiences or near-death phenomena.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's a pretty good chunk of the world's population. So it's not this little kind of, oh, you saw Casper the Friendly Ghost or something, or you must be crazy, or you must be whatever. I think it's pretty much making its way into the, public domain.
So what are some phenomenon or experiences that are often reported, whether there's similarities, differences? What are some common features that we might, hear about when someone describes a near-death experience?
Yeah, now that's an interesting question because there are a lot of common experiences, maybe a list of 10 or 12, but when you actually see statistics on how many had each one, and somebody has 1, 7, 8, 9, and 12, and somebody else has 2, 6, 13, like that.
Yeah.
It looks like there not too many people are having the same thing, but the NDE is usually connected with somebody saying they were in trouble physically. They didn't have anything to do with it, but all of a sudden, boom, they were up above their body. The classic NDE is that they were looking down. People were moving fast, beating on their chest, tried to get them taken care of, and they're kind of thinking subjectively, just leave me alone. I'm doing fine up here. This is beautiful. I've never seen anything like this. This is captivating. And we all measure ourselves by where our consciousness is. And so it often takes them a minute or two to recognize that the guy down at the table is them. But they could generally say they care less because they're up by the ceiling and they know that's where they are. And so they're alive and they're fine. And they often feel peaceful. They often report incredible colors that they later say couldn't even be described, beautiful music, sights, sounds, and they generally don't want to come back. And in some of the surveys across the board, either a high percentage say it was very, very positive. Anywhere up to one report from years ago, 100% of the participants said they no longer fear death. In other ones, that number might be 60 or 70 or 80 or whatever. It depends on kind of what happens to them, what's associated with why they had this experience. Maybe they had a lot of pain in their chest because they had a heart attack, or because somebody's beating on their chest. So it's a strange topic, but most of the time the people who have them come back are very calm, and it profoundly affects their life.
Now, when they have these experiences, does it correspond with kind of medical death, like flatline? Is it verified that they've actually died, or is it something that they've experienced while in surgery or in trauma of some sort?
Well, I've heard it both ways. I mean, I've heard women who are giving birth to children saying they must have been dead. They were up above their body, and their husband, in one case, he was a medical doctor. He said in the same conversation, he said, "I don't know why she thinks that. I was looking right at her vital signs on the machines, and she was fine. But she perceives herself to be in danger." There are NDEs when people are not in danger, but regardless, there are dozens now of NDEs that, we use the word flatline. That would be a popular term, but we have dozens of these things where the person, they've had a cardiac arrest. There's different species of cardiac arrest, but they've had a cardiac arrest with, say, ventricular fibrillation. And if the heart stops beating, the brain, according to experiments, you have an absence of brain activity in 14 seconds on average. So let's say by the half a minute mark or 1 minute mark, you would have, if nothing's been restored, you would have no heart reading, no brain reading. And if after that minute or two you report events, because you're hooked up to machines and they know when this happened because the machines maybe show flatline, and and it's 3 minutes later, you don't have, as far as we know, heart or brain backup that would substantiate what you're saying. And yet these people report events. There are hundreds of them now in existence, hundreds of cases where people have reported things that they could not have seen if they were sitting up in that room, totally conscious with a cup of coffee, and they couldn't report this even if it was 6 feet from their outside wall of their house or hospital or whatever.
So if I could stop you just real quick there. This is what you're about to say is super important because, and I've heard when you were over back in January, you were talking about how there's empirical evidence
right.
For these events. So this is important. These aren't just, hey, I had a dream last night or a weird vision.
Right.
This is, hey, I had a weird experience, but here's how I can show you that it was legitimate, and here's why my story is credible.
Right.
I know things I shouldn't know, and so this is what you're about to go into, right?
Right. There are literally, I just debated a guy it was a written debate, and it was published by Blackwell's. It's in the Blackwell Companion to Mind-Body Dualism, and it was a bunch of philosophers arguing mind-body stuff, metaphysics. But as one of the editors said to me, he said, "You have the only empirical chapter in the book." So yeah, I was doing empirical stuff, but in that debate, I couldn't give all of them, but I decided studies that if you subtracted out the overlap and counted how many evidential cases were reported, there are now over 300 of those. Now, maybe 100 of them are such little corroboration, it's just not even worth mentioning. But there are dozens of the 300. Dozens of them are really heavy corroboration, some from miles away. Let's say the person who's in this state is often attracted to where their family is. And if the family's back home, let's say it's an emergency and they may not even know it happened, they may look in on their home 2 miles away and report what mom's doing or so-and-so. But according to the machine, you haven't had heart or brain activity for, let's say now, measurable heart or brain for, let's say, 5 minutes. But they can go back and check it out and ask the woman what she was making for dinner, ask the fellow what he was doing, or maybe if somebody reports a car accident, I'm just making things up now, but if they saw a car accident and they said the stupid driver, the red car, he went right through the stoplight and hit the blue car, and this was 20 minutes after the cardiac arrest, you could get a police report on that with the approximate time it happened. And anyway, there are ways of backing these things up, and there are some really, really heavy accounts of data.
Mm-hmm. So what is the best scientific explanation of what's happening with the near-death experience?
Well, virtually every skeptical criticism, I can't think of one right now that is an exception, but virtually every critical comeback is going to be about something inside the person's brain. So they go, oh, well, you had a right temporal lobe seizure, like what happens in epilepsy, or you had a stroke, or you saw an hallucination, or you had a low oxygen level, or a high oxygen level. You don't know what's going to be suggested. The problem is suggesting things inside my head does not help with corroborative details a mile away.
Mm.
So, like resurrection of Jesus, people can come at you from a whole lot of angles, and there's no line over which they can't pass. They can say anything they want. But in NDEs, you can't keep telling me about what's inside my brain if I'm telling you things that are outside my brain, and if they're corroborated. Now you have an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Because your inside brain explanations can't explain the outside brain corroboration.
Mm. So what is a kind of a spiritual or biblical understanding of NDEs then?
Well, I suppose any philosophy can make use of this, but I'm not a Platonist in the classical sense of that term, but I've always liked what Plato says on a few of these subjects, and I think the biblical explanation is you can see from several biblical passages that I would favor. It's not the only way to say it, but I would favor some kind of dualism where we have an immaterial portion and a material portion. And if the material portion is strapped down on the table and being in danger of being buried in a couple days, why are you so much alive and excited and happy about life and watching things around you? There's a dualistic aspect to it. I would fit that into the biblical, mind-body kind of thinking. I think there are near-death experiences either referred to or even described, or near-death phenomena in Scripture. Stephen sees Jesus in the right hand of God before he is stoned and dies. Jesus tells the, I think, parable in Luke 16 of the man who dies and goes to Abraham's bosom. And of course, that's a story. Mm-hmm. But what Jesus describes is like what people see in a near-death experience. He died and he was carried to Abraham's bosom. A lot of these experiences show a person go down a tunnel. There's no tunnel in the New Testament, but the man was carried there. We've got Paul talking about he went to the third heaven. He says twice, whether out of the body or in the body, I know not which. And he saw things that were unlawful for a man to utter. Interestingly enough, there are a couple of old Bible commentaries that came out prior to this NDE interest. And both of them said Paul's experience in 2 Corinthians 12 would work out nicely, chronologically, to the time when he was left for dead, when he was stoned in Lystra. So, and then Paul subsequently says what a lot of NDEers say. He says twice in 2 Corinthians 5 and Philippians 1, he says, I prefer to die and be with Christ, because going to be with Christ is far better than anything we've got here. Mm-hmm. So that sounds, he could
Yeah.
just get that from meeting the risen Jesus, but you can also get that same attitude from NDEs. So there are things here that are consistent with, I don't say proves,
Yeah.
but NDE phenomena are not foreign to Scripture.
So, Alan and I were talking just a bit before we got on here with you. Well-known people, and I should back up. All sorts of people have near-death experiences. There's no partiality when it comes to who's getting them. So it's not it's not just for kooky people who have near-death experiences, but credible people. There was one philosopher who had a near-death experience, and I can't remember if you and I have talked about this before, but it was A.J. Ayer, right?
Ayer, he may actually have had two, but yeah, he actually had one. Another famous one is Jung, the famous Austrian, I believe, psychiatrist, and he describes going up and looking down and seeing the earth below him, and he uses it to figure into his research. But Ayer is interesting because he was an atheist,
right?
And he's sure that he was there. In fact, at the end of the NDE, he stood before a being that he said he wouldn't call him God. This is strange. He wouldn't call him God, but he called him something like the superintendent of the universe, which are just funny.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
And he was, this isn't God, but I was given to understand he runs everything. Okay, well,
this is what the being we call God does. So
anyway. We can't call that God because our presuppositions say you don't exist. But he has this experience that he comes back, and he said afterwards, he wrote an article. The title is crazy, and I know people give titles to articles. The writers don't necessarily do it. What I saw when I was dead. Well, if you're a naturalist, you don't see anything when you're dead.
Right.
But he ends the article by saying to all my atheist friends in the U.S. and elsewhere, don't worry about me, I'm still an atheist. And however, there are reports, I got one in my file, that he became a lot more religious in the last year or so of his life. And he had several meetings with a famous believing philosopher, and they would go where nobody could hear the conversation. They would go out to a private place at Ayer's home and would discuss what this meant. And his wife later said something like, all I know is that he was a lot nicer to me the last year of our life. So it's hard to say, but yes, he had a very well-known NDE.
That's interesting. So can you give some examples of people who have, like, real stories, who have had NDEs and they come back knowing things they shouldn't know? Can you give some real life examples of that just off the top of your head?
Yeah, I give a lot of them. These are reported in books, so you can get the data. But one is of a lady who is up above her body, and while she's up there, she looks down and she sees one of those riveted numbers on top of a tall machine, a medical machine, and she comes to, and the first thing she says to the nurse in the room is, copy this number down. And she saw a 12-digit number, and she says, I'm obsessive compulsive, and so here's the number. And she had the nurse copy it down, and the number was correct. They sent a guy up there to look, and the number was correct. That's one. Another one was a cute one. Was a lot of cute ones. There's some that are, you might even call them near-death humor, where the woman who was in trouble physically kind of zipped down to where her family was in the waiting room, and she heard her brother-in-law, I think it was her brother-in-law, say something like, we got to get this thing over one way or the other because I've got an appointment to go to. And when she came to, she said, did you say that about me? And he was a little chagrined. So that's an evidential one, but it's a funny one. There are a lot of other funny ones, like a dead patient covered up by a sheet, talking about a doctor and a nurse who were doing things in the room that doctors and nurses weren't supposed to be doing in hospital rooms. And she reported that. I could go on. There is one case where a fella who's being operated on in the Midwest looks all the way in on his home where he had a house sitter, and he gave detailed descriptions of what the guy was doing in his home. Nothing bad. He just told what the guy was doing. And his home was 1,250 miles away.
Wow.
And when he asked the fellow what he was doing, he said, were you doing this, 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 and this? The guy said, yeah, I was. How do you know? And he said, well, I was watching you. And by the way, if I remember my stats correct on that one, he was according to the machines, he was flat brain, flat heart. Wow. He was in a case with no measurable life signs for 30 minutes, as I recall. Wow. And he was able to look in on his friend. Mm-hmm. So those are a few. I mean, I could keep going on and on and on, but there's two famous tennis shoe stories, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast, where the person went up above their body and out of the hospital and reported seeing a tennis shoe on the roof, one of them a blue one and one of them a red one. And the people went up and retrieved the shoes in both situations. Wow. So, so if you had all these internal states, that's precisely the case that you would not be able to report that stuff.
Hmm. Yeah. So what is it that we learn from NDEs? Like, what's the value of this? How does this maybe give us insight into life or the afterlife, or what are the big takeaways from studying NDEs?
I would say a couple takeaways. First of all, religiously, naturalism is wrong. According to Bertrand Russell, and he's far from the only one to say this, but a lot of atheists, as he was, have famously said that the two components of being an atheist are there being no God and no afterlife. And so if there's an afterlife, that would be second only to knowing there's a God for the end of naturalism. And now some of these guys, they'll say, all right, great. So I'm a naturalist, and maybe what you're telling me is there's activity that goes on to the brain for 30 minutes after you die. Okay, good. But a lot of these reports go on longer than that. And while the NDE might be over in 30 minutes, here's another kind of and I'm just making something up. There's a lot of them that are like this. Maybe while the guy is in the NDE state, he meets somebody that he sure is his grandfather, or he sure is his dad. He hasn't seen his father for, let's just say, 3 years, and his dad's been dead. So he's not irreversibly dead, but his father is. And in that meeting, his father says something like, son, I've got some bad news for you. Your favorite cousin was killed in Afghanistan yesterday, and you're going to be getting the telegram in a day or two. And the guy comes out of his NDE, and he's sort of depressed, and he says, I just heard that Marty or so-and-so is died, and sure enough, they get the telegram 2 days later. Now, the interesting thing about that is his consciousness may only have been 30 minutes, but his dad's, you go, how do we know that's his dad? Well, look, I really don't care. It's a person in another realm. Call it a spirit being, call it anything you want. A Christian might say, oh, it was a demon. You can say anything you want to. But if there's another realm, naturalism's wrong. Now, religiously, NDEs teach that all religions, according to some people, they teach that all religions are ways to God. But NDEs, you can't tell which religion is right from an NDE. And for Christians who are like bothered by somebody saying, I met a Hindu god, or I met this or that, remember, those kind of testimonies about being in heaven and what they tell you are not corroborative. The corroborative things are the car accident, the cases I gave, the 12-digit number, the guy looking into his home, the person who sees her son-in-law, her brother-in-law marching around back and forth in the waiting room. Those things are corroborative. We don't have any corroboration for I saw an angel. Now, sometimes Christians would like that. About 20% of NDEs are negative. They're hellish experiences. Well, That's the same criticism. We don't have backup for that. So when someone says, yeah, I saw hell, I was in hell temporarily, that's like you telling me, that's like you giving me your testimony. I'll listen. It's interesting, but I can't know it happened to you.
Yeah.
And so to me, the most interesting thing here is that naturalism is wrong. There is some kind of afterlife, but then we have to go to other evidences of which Christianity has a good dozen major ones that would tell you it's Christianity. And if anybody wants to challenge Christianity on dates of documents or how many you have, or did Jesus do miracles versus their prophet or whatever, or if they want to compare any category, they're going to lose on the evidence. So you can go to other evidences to talk about which religion is true. One more thing. That's two. Naturalism is wrong. Number two, some kind of afterlife. And number three, there's some pastoral things that come from this, because for people who are absolutely afraid of death, i.e. Hebrews 2:14 and 15, those who are absolutely afraid of death, this tells you that if you're in Christ, you're going to be somewhere else. And sometimes they're even told, I just heard one a couple of days ago where the person said, you'll be back here again. And that's not evidential for me, but it's evidential for them. And it calms them. They almost totally lose their fear of death. So there are pastoral side effects. I'd say those are three important things.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, I speaking of the pastoral side of things, I heard a story, and I need to reach out to this guy because I felt horrible for him. He was in the military, and he was in some sort of plane crash or something, and during that event, he had a near-death experience. And one of the things he reported was being in the presence of someone, and this is the way he put it, which I thought was interesting. He said, this being of nothing but light, and he knew that this being had the ability to make him cease to exist if he so wanted, but at the same time he felt what he described as unconditional love. Yep. And it really changed him and stuff. But there were other components about the experience that were kind of weird. I mean, there weren't anything that I recall that were too weird, but it was just kind of an odd story, as they often are. But anyway, this guy, if I remember right, he went to a local pastor, and the pastor just totally dismissed him, and I think made him feel horrible. And so now he's kind of gone into what I would call non-Orthodox sort of Christians or non-Orthodox sort of spirituality. And I walked away from hearing that story thinking, we should listen more to these people who have these experiences, because as Christians, we have categories to make sense of these sorts of things, but sometimes in some strands of Protestant American Christianity, we're so anti these sorts of experiences. And so anyway, I always thought I appreciated that your pastoral concern there, but it seems like at least some pastors don't look at it that way.
Yeah, and along those lines, so if our listeners are, we're thinking, average people in the pew, average Christians, just, wondering about these things, or somebody asks them about them, what are some things that you could possibly suggest to help them understand or approach this subject with friends and family and think through it for themselves?
You know what? Some people, I mean, I'm like this. I would like you simply to give me the evidence that you were somewhere, that an airtight case, no brain, no heart, as far as we know from machines, and you're reporting data. I want the evidence. But I would say for probably a majority of people, I would have a favorite person or two who's been there and introduce them and let the person talk personally to them, either face-to-face, on the phone. I think for the average person, if you interview a near-death person, it's the most incredible thing you'll probably ever do in your life. Mm. It is to hear them, to look in their eyes while they talk, and to say to yourself, they could be mistaken about this or that, but they totally believe they are correct. They are very sincere. They're not lying. And when you hear them describe what heaven's like, I've heard many of these descriptions firsthand, and they are, well, there's nothing like it. And someone could rightly say, well, hey, bud, there's no evidence here. That's fine. I'm that kind of guy too. So if you want to talk evidence, switch subjects and talk to somebody who has evidence. But because there's plenty of them, like I said, 300 cases that I know of. But just a pastoral one, I think I would let him talk to a person who's been there and let that person affect them. I remember we had a person in our church not long ago who had a near-death experience. And then I've got a good friend here, a psychologist, who had a near-death experience many years ago. I was teaching this in a PhD course months ago, just recently in September. And out of, I think, 12 people in class, 2 of them had near-death experiences. I mean, real ones. One of them, they're both from the old world. One of them was from India and one of them was from Syria. And the Indian fellow fell out of a tree and fell down 25 feet and landed on his head. And when he told the story, it was kind of funny because he was a very sharp guy, but he was kind of a tease. And he leaned forward and pulled his hair apart and showed everybody the scar on the top of his head. And he's up there, and I was laughing. I said, "You're up in the branches." And he goes, "Yep, that's where I was. I was up in the branches." But all that means is he wasn't hanging on anything. He was just up there. And he watches, it seems a mildly evidential account. He watches his mom come out, and she's crying and screaming, and don't go. Why'd you have to climb up there? What's wrong with you? And he's going, "Mom, I'm fine. I'm fine." And of course, she can't hear them. And there's many stories like that where they can't hear him. And but he could report what she said, and he was out. But later in that week, we were talking about the other one was a young lady who was in a car accident in Syria. I think it was Syria, and the car rolled several times, and somebody was even killed in the car, her father-in-law, and she had a near-death experience. And we were talking later that week about Christian experiences, and I turned to the 2 of them, and I said, I went to each one of them by name, and I said, "Can anybody talk you out of your NDE?" And they both said, "Not a prayer." I said, "I couldn't take it away from you." Nope. "I couldn't tell you you're crazy or hallucinating." Nope. "Why not? I know I was there. Just like I know I went to the store last night and bought a loaf of bread. I'm just as sure." And when you hear people talk like that, that's probably the person I would plug in with the normal person pastorally who wants to know what these things are. Just let them hear and be calmed by a description of what they experienced in the afterlife.
Yeah.
So there's always a there's always a plethora of books and movies about near-death experiences, often involving a journey to heaven and encountering Jesus. What are some areas of discernment? I've seen several of these. They're moving. They can often be compelling in some of the accounts. I'm thinking of some of the books that I read years ago. I think 90 Minutes in Heaven. But at the same time, there's this skeptical side of me that says, wait a minute, are they really seeing Jesus, and why is it also different in some circumstances and so forth? I mean, where is maybe adjudication or discernment in how we go about evaluating some of these, especially the more sensational claims?
Sure. Well, in the famous one, or one of the famous ones, where the little 4-year-old boy had an NDE, Burpo, I think was his last name, and he described some strange things like Gabriel and a multicolored horse, and I think these are normal mechanisms of people who are struggling, who are in a really rough shape. He had almost died, and who are in real rough shape, and they have gaps in their memory, and they are struggling to put it together, and it's just typically human to fill in gaps where we don't have details.
Huh.
And so someone goes, "Yeah, well, that's my problem. It's all a bunch of bunk." And then I'll go, "Time out. You want to hear a few evidential cases? Because I can guarantee you they're not going to be able to explain them away." I mean, they're just incredible. And so the way I listen to these stories is kind of Maybe so. I can't be sure, but exactly of all your details. But I can listen. And when enough people tell me about, like for example, one thing virtually everybody says is they experience unconditional love and light. Those are very common. Well, here's a pastoral example again. So I was giving a message recently, and I spoke about answers to prayer, and I was dealing with the objection that how come we're abandoned? You know, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why do we seem to feel abandoned? And I said, look, this story may not be true to a T, but just to give you something to think about, it's a story, and we don't know about stories. We have a lot of evidential NDEs, but I don't know if people meet Jesus or not. I don't know. But I said countless people have said they met Jesus. Jesus didn't even talk. All he did was hug them, and everything was all right. They knew he was everything he said he was. They knew he had never broken a promise. They knew he'd been faithful, and maybe not a sentence had passed between them. And I tell people that's a practical little story. Enough people tell that it's at least possible on those days when you think the Lord doesn't hear you or he's abandoned you. It could all be straightened out 2 minutes in his presence without words. An answer is that easy. So give Jesus the benefit of the doubt, given the fact that almost all critics today believe he did miracles, or just like whatever the cases were in the Gospels. They believe something happened to Jesus. More people believe something really happened to Jesus than those who believe nothing happened to Jesus after the cross. So all this evidence for the resurrection, all the evidence for the empty tomb, all the evidence for Jesus being a miracle worker. By the way, just stay tuned. I mean, there's new data came out on the Shroud of Turin, which is just mind-breaking. In the Oxford Journal that published the original 88 article trying to debunk the Shroud, just published an article in October, 2 months ago, that refutes that. And so that leaves the way open for this thing being Jesus's. Nobody has anything like that. Nobody has data like that. Manuscripts, nobody. And so when someone says, yeah, but that's just a story, and you said yourself it might not be true, I'll say, yeah, time out. Let's go to resurrection. Let's go to other evidences. And all the point is that Jesus, I understood in a minute that he was fine. That's just a pastoral reflection. And I think even if you don't think that could have happened, God is totally, he could explain. I tell people God could explain the problem of evil in one sentence. And we'd go, oh, man, I never thought about that. And that's one thing I've learned from NDEs, that the stories don't have to be literally true to understand that. But they came back thinking they had just gotten a key to the universe.
That's good. Well, just wrapping it up, I want to respect your time here. So I asked Craig Keener this question when we chatted about miracles and supernatural kind of stuff. But why the bias in Western intellectual tradition? Why the bias? And is that changing? And that's you could write a dissertation on that, but
I guess the bias toward naturalism.
I'm sorry, the bias toward naturalism, and skepticism toward.
You already wrote your dissertation.
Yeah. I don't want to do it again.
No, I don't either. I think that's multi-causal. The Western world today is, at least universities and so on, North America, Northern Europe, is run by naturalism, church attendance. Most things confessional have gone down. I was over in Sweden a few years ago, and they had just de-state, whatever the word is, they had just unauthorized the Lutheran Church as being the state church, and that's more the where we are with people today. And I think they don't like it because it'd be like if someone got up in your face and told you Christianity wasn't true, and all of a sudden you thought, oh no, what if I have to stand before the atheist case? What if I have to stand before a judgmental God who doesn't like me, and I've blown it all these years? They're not very comfortable, and they often get very angry. I think that's one reason, because the West is highly prejudiced, and that's why we've got to talk about evidence. But my second comment is I think it's changing. For all our criticism of this generation is not churchy, but this generation, according to all the polls, is more religious. So I think with the data, NDEs, this new shroud stuff, I think things are coming out that are going to make people say, wow, something's going on out there. I don't know what it is, but there's another world. And I think that's going to shape reality and shape discussion.
I think that's a good spot to end. That's really good. Yeah. Well, hey, yeah, thank you for your time. We appreciate you and all you do for the church and the kingdom. All right. Well,
hey, guys, I lost the picture here halfway